The Israel-Palestine conflict has been going on now for about 100 years, and until October 2023, analysts and governments were desperate to ignore this generational beef. Even Arab states like Egypt and Saudi had basically moved on, adopting a sort of fake it till you make it form of peace building. Well, to put it lightly, that didn't work. And since October 7th, the war in Gaza is pretty much the only thing anyone can talk about. It's all over the news, it's all over the internet, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains one of the most divisive topics in world politics. This fact is crystallised around South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, which is the UN's highest legal body. They asked a group of judges to consider whether Israel's actions in Gaza amount to a genocide against the Palestinian people, which sparked a load of discourse from people on all sides of the debate. And it's obviously an important question. I mean, genocide's probably the worst crime it's possible to commit, so I'm sure the public debate around it has been reasonable, nuanced, and level-headed, hasn't it? Oh, for fuck's sake. Well, I think it is an important topic, and I think Douglas Murray and Norman Finkelstein are not the kind of people who are worth listening to about it. So I'm going to save you the effort of watching hours of legal debate.
Some has shuffled my papers.
And we're going to run through the various different threads that are in play when we ask a question as serious as whether Israel is guilty of genocide, which is exactly the kind of cheery, easygoing content that YouTube was made for. So like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's crack on. Alright, so what this really comes down to is how you define genocide. And most of us, when we hear that word, our minds go straight to the Holocaust, to the Rwandan genocide, which we might think of as what political scientists call an ideal type, which is kind of the purest example of what a given concept represents. And if you look at these cases, what you see is an active and intentional effort to murder every member of a specific ethnic group. So we tend to think of genocide in those terms, as an effort to wipe out an entire race of people. Now, if we take that definition, it's pretty hard to make a case that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, because although 30,000 deaths is a lot, it's, and I hate to use this word, only around 2% of Gaza's population. The Rwandan genocide, in contrast, saw more than 800,000 Tutsis massacred by their Hutu neighbours, as many as 10,000 every day, in an atrocity that killed around 70% of the Tutsi population. So if genocide is purely a numbers game, the death rate in Gaza doesn't quite reach the levels we tend to associate with historical genocides, which is a point people like Sam Harris and Coleman Hughes, some of the more reasonable defenders of Israel, often make. They also point out that for an urban counter-terrorism war, the ratio of deaths between combatants and non-combatants in Gaza isn't that different to what we saw during the US invasion of Iraq, for example. That was obviously a disaster, but nobody calls it a genocide. And if we're running with this definition, then the aim of genocide is to kill as many civilians as possible. And if that was Israel's aim, it's not unreasonable to think we'd be looking at a much higher death rate. I mean, the IDF is one of the most advanced military machines in the Middle East. So that's the argument against this genocide claim. And a lot of these things are true. I mean, maybe you can say that Israel couldn't do a Holocaust-style genocide because they lose the Western support they rely on to survive. But you'd think a committed and well-armed military like the IDF could kill a lot more people if it really wanted to. So yeah, if you think the term genocide should be reserved for cases like the Holocaust, when one group tries to completely wipe out the other, then it's difficult to make the case that what Israel is doing in Gaza amounts to a genocide of the Palestinian people. But that's not how everyone thinks genocide should be defined. If you look at the UN definition, for example, genocide is defined as any act committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. Now the in whole or in part bit is what's important here, because it tells us that genocide doesn't refer only to efforts to destroy an entire group of people. It can also refer to acts that try and destroy part of that group, which in practice tends to mean destroying a certain group's existence within a specific area. And there are plenty of cases that fall into this category, what you might call ethnic cleansing, which isn't actually defined in international law but refers to violent efforts to forcibly remove a given population from a specific area. And this is where the definitions start to get a bit muddled, because where we draw this line between ethnic cleansing and genocide gets us into quite philosophical questions about what it means to destroy a national, ethnic or religious group. Does it mean to kill every member of that group so that they completely cease to exist? Or can it mean to destroy them as a group in a certain territory? to destroy their presence in the land the perpetrators claim as their own. Because if it's the latter, you don't need to kill all of the
insert ethnic minority here
to rid them from your country. And history is full of genocides that didn't necessarily kill everyone in a given population, but used violence and political persecution to drive them out of a certain territory. That's what's been going on in Myanmar, where the political persecution of Rohingya Muslims eventually boiled over into violence against a civilian population that has fled the country for fear of being murdered by an army and a state that has consistently violated their human rights. Again, to use this horrible word, only around 25,000 Rohingya Muslims are thought to have been killed in this campaign of ethnic cleansing, whilst more than 750,000 fled to neighbouring Indonesia. And though Myanmar denies that this is a genocide, the Biden administration has referred to it as such, so has the French President Macron, and the UN has said that the crisis bears all the hallmarks of a genocide, recommending that Myanmar's top generals be investigated and prosecuted for genocide. Another example of this kind of genocide is what happened in Bosnia in the late 1990s. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a load of Serbian ultra-nationalists decided that lots of what was Yugoslavia, so Kosovo, Bosnia, Montenegro, actually belongs to the Serbs, which is a national ethnic group in Eastern Europe that used to have its own empire. And back in the day, a lot of this land was part of the Serbian Empire, which only existed for like 30 years, but it became an important symbol in this aggressive version of Serbian nationalism, and you get the idea. Basically, they wanted that land to be inhabited by Serbs, not the other Slavic people who they saw as evil and inferior because of their genetics, their religion, and because that's just what humans choose to believe about other humans. Yay! So they decided to get rid of them, to ethnically cleanse non-Serbs from the territory they believed should be a part of a greater Serbia. And they did that by killing people, most infamously in Srebrenica, where Serbian forces killed around 8,000 Bosniak Muslims for being Bosniak Muslims. Now, that atrocity has been labelled an act of genocide for two main reasons. Firstly, because lots of people were killed on the basis of their identity, but also because that massacre occurred as part of a broader campaign of ethnic cleansing that also included a host of measures meant to destroy non-Serbian communities in a more general sense. Serbian militias, for example, destroyed homes, businesses, places of worship, and assassinated influential politicians, intellectuals, and professionals. And these acts were carried out in the hope that non-Serbian communities would be so damaged and so traumatized that they would rather run away than face the oncoming Serbian forces. Now, this wasn't a Holocaust. Again, only something like 2 or 3% of the Bosniak population died in these attacks. But it's seen as a genocide because Serbian forces used violence against civilians and civilian infrastructure so as to drive non-Serbs out of what Serbian ultra-nationalists saw as their land, which in the eyes of international lawyers and genocide scholars constituted an attempt to destroy non-Serbs as an ethnic group in this imagined Greater Serbia. Now, lots of people, including an old hero of mine, Noam Chomsky, don't like to apply the term genocide to what happened in Bosnia because they think that label should be reserved for cases like the Holocaust that really do try and wipe out an entire race of people. At least, that's what they say. It may also be because admitting Bosnia was a genocide means that NATO is probably right to intervene in the conflict, and they're all committed to dying on the all-Western military intervention is bad hill, but that's not really the point right now. The fact is, the UN and most experts in the field of genocide studies have considered Bosnia a genocide for years now, and if we accept that destroying part of a group's population as part of a broader effort to ethnically cleanse them from a given territory constitutes a genocide, then it's much easier to make that case against Israel. Because although Israel hasn't killed everyone in Gaza, at least 30,000 people are dead, which is similar to the number and proportion of people who died in Bosnia and Myanmar. Beyond that, the IDF has demolished entire rows of houses, mosques and hospitals have been bombed, civilian infrastructure basically doesn't exist anymore, and there's barely enough food, water and medicine to sustain the population. And these things are typical of this kind of toned down form of genocide, because it's impossible to live under those conditions, which is why the ICJ found the genocide case against Israel plausible enough to issue preliminary measures against the Israeli government. So the issue is partly that the war and the way it's been waged creates a lot of pressure pushing Palestinians to leave Gaza, which, if we're running with this ethnic cleansing is genocide framework, would presumably be the aim of the operation. But the truth is, although something like 85% of the Palestinians in Gaza have had to leave their homes, they don't have anywhere to go. The border's closed on all sides. So they're still in Gaza, which I suppose you could use to argue, no, this isn't ethnic cleansing, because look, they're still there. But this is where the debate gets a bit silly, because, as I say, they don't have anywhere to go. If Egypt opens the Rafah crossing tomorrow and 1.5 million Palestinians flee across the border, does that make it an ethnic cleansing and therefore a genocide? Is that label contingent on Egypt's actions? That doesn't make much sense to me. I think if we are to say that Israel is committing a genocide, that should be because of Israel's actions, not because Egypt does or doesn't open its border. And if you think the term genocide only applies once 1 million Palestinians have run away, you have to ask why prominent Israeli politicians are openly calling for Gazans to be relocated to other Arab countries. It's also worth bearing in mind that Israel has recently been playing down the Bosnian genocide, which they say dilutes the concept of genocide and is almost insulting to the victims of the Holocaust. Though a more sceptical person might think they're starting to worry about being hit with that same label. Who knows? This brings us to the second element of the UN definition, which is all to do with intent. For something to be considered an act of genocide, at least under international law, it has to be intentionally genocidal. And defenders of Israel really focus on this point. They don't deny that civilians are dying or that people's homes are being destroyed. They just say that that isn't Israel's intention. From this perspective, the war in Gaza isn't an act of genocide, it's an act of self-defense. And Israel is simply looking to ensure its security by destroying Hamas, which they describe as a violent terrorist group with its own genocidal ambitions. And there's a lot of truth to that. I know some left-wing weirdos have a soft spot for Islamic fascism, but you can make a pretty good case that the attack on October 7th was itself an act of genocide. I mean, Hamas went door to door in these little Israeli villages, committing the kinds of violent atrocities you associate with Caesar's legion. And Hamas doesn't even try to hide its genocidal intentions. Its leaders have literally promised to do this again and again, and before they rewrote it for PR reasons, their manifesto proudly invoked Islamic scripture that calls for the destruction of the Jews. So another argument against this genocide claim is that you can't expect Israel to do nothing when its people have been the victims of such an attack. And many Israelis argue that given Hamas's words and actions, Israel will only be safe when Hamas has been destroyed. Now, whether or not you agree with that or whether that's even possible, it's clear that destroying Hamas is costing a lot of civilian lives. But those on the Israeli side would argue that that is because Hamas embeds itself in civilian areas that make it difficult for Israel to hit legitimate military targets without hurting innocent civilians. And again, there's a lot of truth to this. Groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have years of documentation around how Hamas will fire rockets from civilian areas on the logic that Israel will be reluctant to hit back, because to do so would mean killing lots of civilians, which obviously looks bad for a supposedly liberal country like Israel. And this isn't really the focus right now, but this kind of logic relies on the idea that Israel will care more about Palestinian civilians than Hamas, which I think really highlights the moral depravity of Hamas and other jihadist groups, but hey ho. The point is that there are valid arguments you can make in Israel's defense, but that's not the end of the debate. I mean, you could argue that an accidental genocide is pretty much as bad as an intentional one, but even maintaining the importance of intent, there are reasons to question Israel's motivations. Because what this really comes down to is whether you think Israel is killing Palestinians because they're Palestinians, or because it's the only way to defend Israel from Hamas. And although I do think Hamas couldn't care less about putting civilians in harm's way, I don't think that logic justifies this degree of violence. Because at some level, Israeli officials are still deciding how many Palestinian civilians they're happy to kill to neutralise Hamas. And that decision is coloured by the fact that they're Palestinian. Israeli reporters have quoted Israeli intelligence officials who say they actually leave this to a computer to figure out, which is dystopian as fuck. And in one case, the IDF apparently approved the killing of hundreds of Palestinian civilians in an attempt to assassinate a single top Hamas military commander. Now, that ratio seems a bit extreme to me. Obviously, I can't say for sure, but I don't think Israel would spend 30,000 Israeli lives to destroy Hamas. I mean, according to the Times of Israel, Israel has lost fewer than 25,000 soldiers over the course of its entire existence. So even if you see it as collateral damage, which is a terrible way to describe the amount of mass murder we're comfortable with, Israel is only willing to accept this level of collateral damage because it's Palestinians who are doing the dying. They're more expendable because they're Palestinian. Now, all countries do this in some way, which is why nationalism is a disease. But the case South Africa presented to the ICJ, for example, listed a host of statements from Israeli politicians saying things like, "We must completely destroy Gaza, there will be no water, you will get hell." And all of this just adds credence to the idea that the destruction and humiliation of the Palestinian people isn't an accident, it's the explicit goal of Israeli policy. Now, defenders of Israel, like Elion Levy, who was a spokesman for the Israeli government, say that these comments are made by fringe politicians who have no control over military policy. You know, people like the Prime Minister. And because it's only weirdos on the margins who are saying these things, they shouldn't be taken as being as representative of Israel's goals. Now, to be honest, this is a bullshit argument, because the fact is that Israeli society has a serious problem with fascism. Netanyahu is literally a fascist, who spent the last 12 months trying to create a fundamentalist dictatorship in the Holy Land. And that's not an exaggeration. Him and his boys came this close to completely undermining Israel's Supreme Court, which is the only check Israeli society has on the state's power. And the idea behind that was to give his supporters, who are far-right religious fanatics, the ability to pass the harsh religious laws that have, until now, been blocked by the Supreme Court. So even if Netanyahu himself is just in it for the money, the power, whatever, his political career depends on support from far-right religious extremists who openly call for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from what they see as Jewish land. And the Israeli government has, in no small way, been infiltrated by these religious fascists. People like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, elected officials and even cabinet members who use their platforms to call for the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank and the re-establishment of Jewish settlements in Gaza. Which is actually an important point. This messaging is pretty common in Israel. You hear it from journalists, politicians, and more politicians. So much so that liberal Israelis published an open letter at the start of the war condemning what they called incitement to genocide in their own country. Now, it's easy to overlook these kinds of comments as the rantings of loony politicians. But I think that's a mistake, because this kind of language has real power, and it embeds the kind of attitudes that produce genocides by dehumanizing Palestinians and portraying them as little more than pests in what is supposedly Israeli land. It's important to understand that genocides don't occur in a vacuum. They're the result of weeks, months, and years of escalating hatred. This clip of a young Israeli woman laughing at the idea of killing Palestinians is from a video that came out in 2017. So these ideas aren't new. They've been promoted by extremists and opportunists for years. And in that context, genocide doesn't have to be the state's explicit policy for genocide to be the result. Military officials and politicians don't have to stand up and tell the IDF to kill Palestinian civilians. A wink and a nod, like these references to biblical scripture, are more than enough to create that kind of atmosphere and encourage the extremists who are already in the IDF to take that into their own hands. The irony here is that this is exactly how modern anti-Semitism works in many Western countries. Elon Musk and Donald Trump, for example, are pretty popular with anti-Semites, but they're not on Twitter talking about how they hate the Jews. Instead, they cry about how George Soros wants to destroy Western society and how these rich, shadowy elites are out to get them. And if you're a card-carrying anti-Semite, that's music to your ears. You know exactly what they're talking about, and you take a lot of energy and encouragement from those kind of comments. And the same thing is going on in Israel. I'm sure there are lots of good people in the IDF who want nothing but peace with the Palestinians, but a lot of them will harbour this settler ideology, this aggressive form of Zionism that says all the land west of the Jordan River really belongs to the Jews.
Every little spot, everything is the Jews.
And if you already believe that, you don't need an email from your sergeant laying it all out. If you've grown up around this kind of messaging, and you've been at least a bit radicalised by national service, then hearing influential politicians invoke biblical prophecy and listening to speeches from actual war criminals like Ezra Yakin primes you for a certain level of ruthlessness. And when you scale that up to the level of the state and an army, you're tilting the scales towards the kinds of actions which, overall, contribute to the destruction of the Palestinian people as a national ethnic group in Gaza. You can even see this playing out in real time, because you have ultra-Orthodox battalions of the IDF who are notorious for their treatment of the Palestinians, so much so that the US is threatening to sanction them in particular for their actions in Gaza and the West Bank. Now, really this gets us into the issue of defining the state as a unitary actor, because Israeli society, like every other, is pluralistic. It's made up of lots of competing groups with different ideas about what Israel and Israeli policy should look like. Just in the last year, you've had massive protest against Netanyahu and his fundamentalist friends, for instance. and some IDF reservists even threatened to put down their arms if his judicial reforms went through and successfully transformed Israel into a theocratic dictatorship. So the problem isn't that every Israeli is a genocidal lunatic, it's that the people who wanted those reforms, who want religious law to apply in Israel, who believe that God promised this land to the Jews, and who have made these genocidal statements, are those who are in power, who control the levers of the Israeli state. Which is more than enough reason to be skeptical about Israel's intentions, especially when there's all these videos of the IDF, which has a long history of brutalizing Palestinians, demolishing rows of houses, mosques, schools, and shooting at unarmed civilians, which, if you remember, is all the kind of thing that Serbian forces did in Bosnia. Okay, that was a lot of talking. Let's recap quickly. If the term genocide is to be reserved for cases like the Holocaust, I don't think you can really say that Israel is guilty of genocide. It just isn't the case that Israel is trying to kill every Palestinian. But you could make the argument that what Israel is doing in Gaza amounts to some kind of attempt at ethnic cleansing, or at least it would if the Palestinians had anywhere to go. Besides the fact that thousands of people are already dead, there's almost certainly going to be a famine, and something like 50% of all the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed. Human beings just can't live under those conditions, it's just a fact. So the question then comes down to whether you think ethnic cleansing sits somewhere on the spectrum of things that constitute genocide. And if we take the UN definition, that genocide is an attempt to destroy a national, ethnic, or religious group, then it kind of does. Because forced exile and ethnic cleansing is just another way to destroy that group, as a group, in a certain territory. Okay, so if ethnic cleansing can constitute a form of genocide, and what Israel is doing in Gaza amounts to a form of ethnic cleansing, we then have to consider whether that's intentional or whether it's simply the byproduct of a legitimate anti-terrorism operation. Now, it's very difficult to prove or even understand an individual's intentions, let alone a state's, so I'm not sure there's an objective answer to this. But given that the actions of the IDF line up with the aggressive, religious ideology of Netanyahu's government, I don't think the forcefulness and seemingly indiscriminate nature of the Israeli campaign is an accident. Quite the opposite. Controlled demolitions of houses, hospitals and schools suggest that this is an intentional effort to cause significant damage to the Palestinian community. And IDF insiders have all but admitted this, explaining that Israel bombs what it calls power targets, which include everything from high-rise residential towers to universities and banks, not because they have serious military significance, but because hitting them is meant to exert civil pressure on Hamas. Now, to be fair, this is essentially what Allied powers did during World War II. And some pro-Israeli commentators make this comparison, trying to suggest that there's some double standard here. But Winston Churchill's government wasn't full of people who wanted to make Germany part of the UK, which is a big difference. Most people now are pretty comfortable with the idea that the firebombing of Dresden and Japanese cities constitutes a war crime, which is horrific. But it wasn't a genocide because there was no effort to destroy Germany or Japan as an idea, as a nation. Whereas there is a powerful movement within Israel committed to destroying Palestine as a nation. And that brings us to the final point. So far, we've only spoken about Israel's actions since the 7th of October, but there are those who would say that's a mistake, that to really understand Israel's intentions, we have to look at how their policy on the Palestinians has developed over the years. Some people take this all the way back to 1947, when Israel was created and Jewish militias went around murdering civilians and burning down Palestinian villages. This episode is known as the Nakba, the catastrophe, and anyone who says this wasn't ethnic cleansing is chang shit, to be honest. But if we go that far back, you also get into the fact that hundreds of thousands of Jews from all over the Middle East were chased out of their homes by people who associated them with the State of Israel. So you had this sort of tit-for-tat ethnic cleansing. And Israel has gone through more progressive phases where it did embrace the peace process and progress was made. So I think it's more helpful to focus on the recent history. And if we just look at the last 20 years, for example, which is basically the time Netanyahu's been in power, the trend we see is one of escalating violence against the Palestinian population, especially from Israeli settlers, which is the subsection of Israeli society that has produced extremist politicians like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who now form a powerful part of the Netanyahu government. This violence reached a 20-year high in 2022, and the aim of these attacks is quite explicitly to drive local Palestinians off of the land that these religious Zionists see as their own, to ethnically cleanse them from the land God promised to the Jews. Even Israeli newspapers have referred to these attacks as pogroms designed to intimidate the local population. And this violence is enabled by the Israeli state and the IDF, who hold security control over the majority of the West Bank and who often turn a blind eye to these attacks. The Economist, which is hardly a left-wing newspaper, reports that more than 90% of these cases are thrown out by the courts, which just doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the Israeli state has been co-opted by politicians who are sympathetic to these extremist groups and who get publicly excited by the idea of annexing the West Bank, which is meant to be Palestinian territory, and deporting all of the Palestinians. So within this context, the concern many people have isn't that Israel is going to kill or deport everyone in Gaza. It's that this war will serve to justify Israeli security control over the Gaza Strip, turning it into another West Bank, which will in turn allow extremist settlers to return to Gaza and terrorize the local population while they expand their settlements. So if what's going on in Gaza doesn't quite meet our definition of ethnic cleansing, it's worth considering what's been going on in the long term. And when you look at the historical record, what you see is a constant eating away at what is supposed to be Palestinian territory by extreme religious groups that see that land as belonging to the Jews. And to be honest, it's hard to see how this isn't a slow burning kind of ethnic cleansing. Now, since 2005, when Israel pulled out of Gaza, that's pretty much only been going on in the West Bank. But there's good reason to think it may now be extended into Gaza. Netanyahu has actively called for Israeli security control over the Gaza Strip, for example, and 11 members of his cabinet attended a conference in Jerusalem calling for the re-establishment of Jewish settlements in the area. So in some ways, the war in Gaza isn't necessarily new. It's an evolution of a policy that has existed for years now, one that arguably amounts to a long-term campaign of ethnic cleansing on the part of Israeli settlers who hold more power now than ever before. And this is where the genocide label does start to make some sense, because assuming that Israel doesn't want to kill everyone in Gaza, the war and the way it's heading fits into this broader program of settler violence which, over years and decades, is contributing to the destruction of the Palestinians as a national ethnic group in Palestine. Now that's not the same as what happened during the Holocaust, and if you think that the term genocide ought to be reserved for those cases, then fine. But that doesn't dismiss this gradual, long-term campaign of ethnic cleansing, and it doesn't justify the continued bombardment and blockade of Gaza, which threatens to expand this program across all of what we call Israel and Palestine. The truth is, it's just very hard to judge these things while they're going on. We kind of just have to wait and see what happens. I mean, if Israel just says, right, Hamas is dead and leaves, then I'm not sure you can call this a genocide. Which, to undercut the theme of this entire video, is why this label's kind of irrelevant. It's basically a theoretical question, which is interesting for political science nerds who are desensitized to reading about mass atrocities. But the war isn't theoretical, and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is, in my opinion, completely unjustifiable, regardless of whether or not we apply this very politicized term. If the liberal world order exists for any reason, it is to prevent such abject suffering. And its consistent failure to do so is just one reason so many people are losing faith in liberalism, human rights, and the international organisations that are supposed to protect them. Thanks for watching. I made this video because I'm sick of the way this question tends to be framed, like you're either minimising the Holocaust or justifying famine in Gaza, but I don't want to tell you what to think. I'm hoping that I've explained the territory well enough for you to make your own decision, but more than that, to know why you think Israel is or isn't committing a genocide. So let me know what you think down in the comments, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Cheers.
Who do you support? I mean, Mark likes Israel, I'm Palestine. Makes it more interesting when you pick a... No?